Have you ever seen someone humiliated in public, so unfairly that the whole room went silent, but no one dared to speak? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you, and it might even restore a little of your faith in humanity. It happened in a quiet roadside diner somewhere in the heart of America. Morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, bouncing off chrome counters and half-empty coffee cups. It was just another day, until the door creaked open and a man stepped inside. His clothes were worn, his boots covered in dust, and his eyes carried the weight of stories no one wanted to hear. You could tell right away. He wasn't there for attention. He just wanted a meal, maybe a moment of warmth. The waitress froze. The chatter faded. Behind the counter, the owner looked him up and down with a smirk that could cut glass. "We don't serve beggars here," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. A few customers looked away. Some pretended they didn't. Notice, the man, embarrassed but calm, reached into his pocket, pulling out a few crumpled bills, barely enough for coffee. "I can pay," he murmured. But it didn't matter. The judgment had already been made. What the owner didn't see, or maybe refused to see, was the symbol hanging around the man's neck. Faded dog tags, tapping softly against his chest. He was a veteran, a soldier who'd once stood tall in uniform, now reduced to silence in a place that should have offered comfort. And somewhere in the corner, watching it all unfold, sat another man. Black leather jacket, silver chain glinting in the light, a motorcycle helmet resting beside his coffee cup. He didn't say a word, he just watched. The kind of watch that carries history, the kind that burns injustice into memory. His name was Cole Dawson, and though most people only saw a rough biker, what lived behind his hardened stare was something else entirely. Cole had seen men like that veteran before, men forgotten by the world they once defended. Maybe that's why his hand tightened around his coffee cup. Maybe that's why he didn't look away like everyone else. Because sometimes silence isn't indifference, it's the moment before the storm. The veteran, his name was Jack Turner, apologized softly and turned toward the door. The bell above it jingled as he stepped back into the cold. But the sound didn't fade for Cole. It echoed. Something in that small act of cruelty lit a fire that words couldn't put out. Have you ever witnessed something so wrong that your body reacted before your mind could catch up? That's what happened next. Cole stood, dropped a few bills on the counter, and walked outside. He didn't say a single word to the owner. He didn't need to. Justice doesn't always announce itself. It just rides in quietly before the roar. Outside, he found Jack sitting on the curb beside a rusted trash can, his shoulders slumped under the weight of shame he didn't deserve. Cole removed his leather jacket and draped it over Jack's shoulders, a silent salute from one forgotten man to another. Then, with the same calm precision that once defined his years on the road, he pulled out his phone. What happened after that call would shake the ground beneath that little diner. It would turn silence into thunder, judgment into repentance, and cruelty into something no one there would ever forget. Because sometimes the ones society fears the most, the bikers, the outcasts, the men with scars and leather and loud engines, carry the purest form of loyalty and compassion, and when injustice crosses their path, mercy rides in with steel and thunder. Stay with me, because the moment Cole made that call, everything changed. The air outside the diner had changed. What was once quiet now carried a different kind of tension, the calm before something powerful. Cole stood there, phone still in his hand, the sound of engines faint in the distance like an approaching storm. Jack looked up at him, unsure what was happening, but there was a flicker of hope in his tired eyes, a hope he hadn't felt in a long time. It's strange, isn't it, how one simple act of decency can begin to rewrite an entire story. A jacket shared, a call made, a decision to no longer look away. Maybe that's why stories like this matter, because they remind us that compassion, when shown at the right moment, can still echo louder than cruelty. And maybe that's why you're here, because something about this story touched you too. If it did, tell me. Write it down below. Have you ever seen someone stand up for what's right, even when it wasn't easy? Or maybe you've been in Jack's place, overlooked, misjudged, trying to stay strong when the world turned its back. Your words, your experiences, they help shape this space into more than just a channel. They turn it into a community where stories of justice, empathy, and redemption actually mean something. If you're the kind of person who believes that goodness still has a place in the world, then you're in the right place. So take a second, tap that like button, not just for this story, but for the message it carries. Every click tells the algorithm that these stories matter, that kindness and courage deserve to be seen as much as cruelty does. It's the simplest way to help this message travel a little farther, to someone who might need to hear it today. And if you want to keep riding alongside stories like this, real, emotional, cinematic tales about people who rise from the ashes and prove that humanity isn't lost, then consider subscribing. It's not just a number, it's your way of saying, I'm part of this journey too. Each new voice here keeps the fire burning, keeps these stories alive, because together we're building something that's becoming rarer every day, a corner of the internet where empathy still wins, where even on the darkest roads there are still those who fight for the light. Now, remember that sound in the distance? Those engines growing louder. That's where our story continues. The engines drew closer, a low hum rolling across the open road, still too far away to be seen, but near enough to be felt. The sound seemed to pulse through the air, as if justice itself was awakening somewhere beyond the horizon. Cole didn't move right away. He watched Jack, this man who had once worn the same flag on his shoulder, now sitting on cracked pavement like a forgotten part of the story. Jack's hands trembled slightly as he rubbed his thumb over the edges of his dog tags, the metal catching what little light was left in the afternoon. He didn't want pity. He wanted dignity. But in a world that moves too fast to notice broken souls, dignity often becomes a luxury. Jack Turner had been a Marine. Not the kind who talked about it, just the kind who carried the memory in his silence. Afghanistan, 2 tours, honorable discharge. But when he came home, nothing felt like home anymore. The job he was promised disappeared before he even unpacked. Bills stacked faster than his thoughts could catch up. One by one, the lights in his life went out until he found himself sleeping beneath a different kind of sky, the kind that never lets you forget how cold freedom can feel when the world stops caring who you are. He didn't blame anyone, not entirely. It just happens, he'd whisper to himself sometimes. People move on, but deep down, a quiet ache remained. The feeling of being discarded by the same country he'd once protected. That morning, when he walked into the diner, he wasn't asking for charity. He was asking for proof that decency still existed. The smell of bacon and coffee had pulled him in. He stood just inside the door, careful not to drip rainwater on the floor. His jacket was torn, one sleeve darker where the fabric had absorbed too many nights of bad weather. He nodded politely to the woman behind the counter, forcing a small smile, trying not to seem like trouble. For a moment, he thought she might smile back. Instead, she froze, her eyes flicking toward the owner. "Sir," the owner said, his voice dripping with disdain, "this isn't a shelter. You can't just walk in here." Jack lowered his gaze, fingers brushing over the metal tags again. "I can pay for a coffee," he said softly. His voice cracked, the kind of crack that comes from years of swallowing words that never found a place to land. But the man behind the counter only smirked. "You think anyone here believes that?" He looked toward the customers. A few chuckled nervously. One older woman shook her head. Another turned her face to the window. It was easier to pretend they didn't see what was happening. Easier to hide behind comfort than confront cruelty. At the corner table, Cole Dawson watched. He'd been riding since dawn, chasing something he couldn't quite name. Maybe peace, maybe distraction. He wasn't part of a group that day. It was just him, his bike, and the endless hum of the road. He liked diners like this because they reminded him of the America he used to believe in, where people looked each other in the eye, where kindness wasn't rare. But what he saw that morning stirred something in him that went deeper than anger. It was recognition. He saw in Jack the same emptiness he'd once carried after losing his brothers in a crash years back, the same hollow space that no amount of roaring engines or open highways could fill. Cole's instinct told him to stay quiet, but his conscience refused to stay seated. He felt the weight of the decision forming in his chest, a quiet kind of fury that doesn't shout but acts. When Jack turned to leave, his boots scraping softly against the tile, Cole stood. He left money on the table, enough to cover the untouched coffee and a tip that would sting the owner's pride. As he stepped outside, the cold wind hit his face. Jack was there, sitting on the curb, his shoulders hunched against the drizzle. Cole walked over, unzipped his jacket, and laid it across the man's back. Without saying a word, the gesture surprised Jack more than the warmth. "Why'd you do that?" Jack asked, voice shaking. Cole looked out toward the horizon. "Because no one did it for me when I needed it." There was a pause between them, heavy with unspoken truths. In that silence something shifted, a subtle exchange of respect that didn't need ceremony. Cole took out his phone, the screen reflecting the clouds overhead. He scrolled for a moment, then hit call. Jack frowned. "You calling?" "Someone." Cole nodded once. "Yeah, family." He didn't mean blood. He meant the kind of family forged through asphalt and pain, through nights spent fixing broken bikes and broken hearts. The kind of family that understood loyalty wasn't a word, it was a way of life. Inside the diner, laughter continued, unaware that the ground was about to tremble. Jack watched Cole's face as he listened to the phone ring, his eyes steady, his expression unreadable. He'd seen men like him before, tough, solitary, bound by invisible codes, but there was something different about this one, something steadier. Minutes passed. Then came the sound, the distant thunder of 100 engines, faint at first, then louder, like a gathering storm sweeping across the open plains. The windows of the diner began to vibrate. Forks paused mid-air. Conversations died mid-sentence. People turned their heads toward the parking lot. The first to appear were the headlights, dozens of them slicing through the grey sky, reflecting off chrome and leather. Then came the bikes, roaring down the road in perfect formation, black jackets catching the wind. They didn't race. They advanced with purpose, every rumble synchronized like a heartbeat. Jack stared, bewildered. "Who are they?" Cole slipped on his gloves, eyes fixed on the approaching storm. "Brothers," he said simply, "the kind that don't forget." The roar grew deafening as the convoy pulled into the parking lot, engines idling like beasts waiting for command. People inside pressed against the glass, the same faces that had turned away now, watching with unease. Cole walked to the door, pushed it open, and stepped back inside, the heavy scent of leather and rain following him. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He just looked at the owner, who suddenly seemed much smaller than before. "You wouldn't serve one soldier," Cole said, his tone calm, almost polite. "So we'll take his place." One by one, the bikers filed in, filling every table, every stool, every empty seat. They ordered meals, they spoke quietly, they tipped generously, and the entire diner fell into a silence so thick it could have been a prayer. Jack remained outside for a moment, still trying to process what was happening. The sound of laughter and cutlery began to drift through the open door. But it wasn't the laughter of mockery anymore, it was the awkward laughter of awakening. For the first time in years, someone had stood up for him without asking for anything in return. In that moment, something inside Jack began to thaw, the part of him that had stopped believing people could still surprise him. He pressed his hands together, feeling the warmth of Cole's jacket, and whispered a quiet thank you to no one in particular. The diner's owner stood frozen, his arrogance stripped bare by the quiet dignity surrounding him. Every plate served to the bikers was a reminder of what compassion looks like when power shifts hands. Every dollar they left on the counter was more than payment. It was a lesson, and as the meal went on, the atmosphere began to change. The waitress, once hesitant, approached Jack outside with a plate. She didn't make excuses or give speeches. She just said softly, "I didn't know." It was the kind of apology that doesn't erase the past, but acknowledges it, the kind that cracks open the door for transformation. Jack took the plate, nodded once, and smiled, just enough to let her know he forgave her. Inside, Cole caught the moment. Through the glass, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to smile too. It's easy to talk about justice, to share quotes about kindness or redemption online, but what happened that day wasn't theory, it was proof. Proof that actions still matter, that courage can come from anyone, even from men society often fears, the ones covered in tattoos and scars, the ones who've seen too much and still choose to protect rather than destroy. The world outside that diner kept moving. Cars passed, clouds drifted, life went on. But for everyone who was there, something invisible had shifted. A mindset, a belief, a quiet revelation that empathy could still command respect. And for Jack Turner, it was the first step of a journey he didn't even know he was on. A journey not just back to stability, but back to himself. Because sometimes redemption doesn't arrive in sermons or speeches. It arrives on two wheels, wearing leather and carrying the sound of thunder. And sometimes the road to healing begins the moment someone decides to stop watching and start acting. The last of the bikers finished their meals and stepped outside, the engines growling back to life one by one. Cole waited by his bike, glancing at Jack, then at the open road ahead. He didn't need to say anything. The invitation was clear. Jack looked down at the dog tags around his neck, then at the jacket resting on his shoulders. For the first time in years, he stood up not because he had to, but because he wanted to. And just like that, a new chapter began, written not in ink, but in roaring echoes and quiet grace, somewhere between what had been lost and what was about to be found. The smell of fried eggs and coffee lingered in the air, thick and comforting to everyone except the man standing at the counter. Jack's hands trembled slightly as he reached into his pocket, pulling out a few wrinkled bills. They looked smaller in his rough, calloused fingers, fingers that had once held rifles, not loose. "Change. It's just a coffee," he said quietly, eyes downcast. His voice was steady, almost rehearsed, as though he'd said that same sentence in dozens of places before, hoping one of them might show mercy. The owner, a man with a clean white apron and a sharp tongue, crossed his arms and let out a laugh that cut through the diner like a blade. "A coffee? You really think I'm going to serve you? You look like you crawled out of the back alley." He leaned closer, his voice rising just enough for everyone in the room to hear. "Don't try that I'm a veteran act with me, pal. I've seen enough fakes wearing dog tags from thrift stores." For a second, the world seemed to stop. Jack froze, his dog tag still resting against his chest, swaying with the movement of his shallow breath. His lips parted slightly, as though he wanted to defend himself, but no words came. Around him, chairs creaked, coffee cups clinked against saucers, and the silence that filled the space was worse than laughter. It was the silence of complicity. From the corner booth, Cole Dawson's jaw flexed. He didn't say anything, he just watched. The tension in his shoulders tightened beneath his leather jacket, veins rising along his arms. He wasn't new to cruelty. He'd seen men tear each other apart over less, both on the road and in life. But there was something about this moment, something raw and wrong, that stirred an old rage he hadn't felt in years. Jack swallowed hard and nodded once, still trying to maintain a trace of dignity. "I understand," he murmured. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." But the owner wasn't finished. Some men, once they've tasted power, can't resist showing it off. "Trouble," he said, smirking. "You showing up here is trouble. You think people want to eat next to someone who smells like that? Why don't you do yourself a favor and keep walking? There's a shelter downtown. Maybe they'll feed you if you cry hard enough." Laughter broke out from a table near the door. It wasn't loud, but it was cruel enough to echo. A younger man in a suit snorted into his coffee. The waitress hesitated by the counter, pretending to wipe something just to avoid looking at Jack. The old woman by the window shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting away. No one spoke up. Jack took a breath that didn't quite reach his lungs. "Thank you anyway," he said softly, his voice cracking under the weight of shame. Then, with quiet restraint, he turned toward the exit. His boots squeaked faintly on the linoleum floor, the sound following him like an accusation. Cole's hand twitched. He wanted to stand, to say something, anything, but something held him still. Years of trying to stay out of other people's messes had taught him that not every battle needed fighting. And yet, as he watched Jack push open the diner door, his mind whispered one word he couldn't ignore: enough. Outside, the sky was grey, the kind of grey that sinks into your bones. Jack stepped onto the cracked pavement, shoving his hands into his pockets as a light drizzle began to fall. His breath came out in slow clouds. He didn't look angry, just tired. Tired in a way that comes from carrying too much disappointment for too long. Inside, the owner shook his head and muttered to no one in particular, "People like that ruin neighborhoods." He grabbed a towel and went back to wiping the counter as if nothing significant had happened. But Cole couldn't look away. He stared at the door, hearing the faint jingle of the bell. That marked the moment a man's last piece of pride had been dismissed. A fragment of memory surfaced, his father's voice, raspy from years of smoking and regret. "The measure of a man isn't how he treats his equals, son. It's how he treats the ones who can't fight back." Cole hadn't thought about that in years. He rubbed a scar on his knuckle, one he'd earned in a bar fight long ago, back when he thought fists were the only language people understood. He turned his head toward the counter. "You always treat your customers like that?" His voice was calm, but there was something dangerous beneath it. The owner glanced at him and shrugged. "You call that guy a customer? He's a con artist in uniform. Probably stole those tags from someone who actually served." Cole's eyes narrowed. "You sure about that?" "Yeah," the owner said, smirking. "You know how many stories I've heard? They all say the same thing. I'm a vet. I just need a meal. Next thing you know, they're out back stealing your propane tank." Cole stood slowly, the chair legs scraping against the tile with a long, low sound that made the laughter at the nearby table stop. He reached into his pocket and dropped a few bills beside his empty cup. "Then you've been listening to the wrong stories." He walked out, pushing the door open just as a gust of wind swept through. Outside, Jack was sitting by the curb, staring at the puddles gathering near the edge of the road. Cole took a deep breath, knelt beside him and said, "You were in the service?" Jack nodded without looking up. "Yeah, Marine Corps, 1st Battalion, 7th Marines." His voice was quiet, factual. No pride, no bitterness, just truth. "You?" Cole hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Army, Fort Hood, long time ago." Jack glanced up, studying the man in front of him. The biker's face was rough, weathered, his eyes shadowed but steady. There was something in that look that made Jack sit up a little straighter. "You don't look like you judge people much," he said. Cole gave a faint smile. "I've done too much wrong to start judging others." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a cigarette, lighting it with the kind of slow deliberation that comes from experience. "That guy inside, he ever serve?" Jack shook his head. "Doesn't look like it." Cole took a drag and exhaled toward the grey sky. "Then he doesn't get to talk about what service means." They sat there for a moment in silence. Cars passed, people walked by without noticing them. But something was shifting, an invisible current pulling the story in a new direction. Jack didn't know it yet, but his life was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. The drizzle turned into steady rain. Cole stood, shrugged off his leather jacket, and draped it over Jack's shoulders. "Here, you'll need it more than I do." Jack looked down at the jacket, confused. "I can't take this." "Not asking," Cole replied. His tone was firm but kind, the voice of someone who had long ago learned the difference between charity and respect. That simple act carried more weight than any apology could. It wasn't about the jacket. It was about being seen. For the first time in years, Jack wasn't invisible, and that visibility, raw, sudden, human, hit him harder than the rain ever could. Cole pulled out his phone, thumb hovering over the screen. He hesitated for a second, then pressed a number labeled Brothers. The ringtone buzzed faintly beneath the sound of falling rain. Jack frowned. "Who are you? Calling?" Cole's lips curved into a faint grin. "A few friends who don't like watching good men get disrespected." The tone in his voice carried a quiet certainty. It wasn't vengeance. It was justice, the kind that travels with its own gravity. Somewhere deep down, Jack felt a mix of confusion and awe. He didn't know what was about to happen, but for the first time in a long time, he felt something that had been buried under the weight of humiliation. Hope. Back inside, the owner poured another cup of coffee, blissfully unaware of the storm that was building outside his diner walls. To him, it was just another morning, another face he'd pushed away. But the hidden truth was already in motion. The kind of truth that doesn't knock. It crashes through doors when least expected. And as the first rumble of engines echoed faintly in the distance, Cole's gaze hardened. The rain slid down his face, but his eyes never wavered. The sound was growing louder now, a low vibration under the asphalt, a promise of something bigger than revenge, something that would turn a small act of cruelty into a lesson no one there would ever forget. Jack turned toward the noise, puzzled. "What's that?" Cole flicked away his cigarette, the ember dying in the rain. "That," he said, sliding his helmet on, "is what respect sounds like." He swung his leg over the bike, kicked the engine to life, and waited for the thunder to arrive. The horizon trembled under the weight of it. Not rage, not rebellion, but the echo of justice, rolling in on 200 roaring engines, ready to rewrite the story that began with a man simply asking for a cup of coffee. And in that moment, somewhere between the rain, the engines, and the slow rise of light through the clouds, something irreversible began to unfold, a transformation not just for one forgotten veteran, but for everyone who had chosen to look away. Cole stood in the rain for a while, letting it soak through his shirt as if he needed the cold to keep from boiling inside. The sound of the diner door slamming behind him was a punctuation mark to everything he had just witnessed. The laughter, the mockery, the hollow silence of people too afraid to care. The truth is, moments like that carve themselves into your memory, not because of the cruelty itself, but because of how easy it is for everyone to pretend it isn't happening. He'd seen that kind of indifference before, in bar fights, in battlefields, in the empty eyes of men who'd long stopped, believing that decency was worth defending. But this time felt different. This time he couldn't walk away. Jack sat on the curb beside Cole's motorcycle, rain dripping from the brim of his cap. The puddles around him reflected the glow of the diner's neon sign, flickering between open and closed, as if the universe itself couldn't decide which side it was on. He was still holding his dog tags, running his thumb over them again and again like a man praying without words. Cole approached quietly, boots crunching against the gravel. For a few seconds, neither spoke. There was no need to. The silence between them was its own language, one born from shared exhaustion, from understanding without explanation. Cole crouched beside him and pulled off his leather jacket, the weight of it heavy and warm in his hands. Without a word, he draped it over Jack's shoulders. Jack looked up, startled. "Man, you don't have to—" "I know," Cole interrupted softly, "but I want to." Jack's eyes flicked to the patch on the back of the jacket, the emblem of a coiled serpent wrapped around a broken chain, with the words "Iron Vows MC" stitched in bold thread. He didn't recognize it, but something about it felt meaningful, like it carried stories of loyalty and loss. "You part of a club?" he asked. Cole nodded once. "Yeah, a brotherhood, I guess. Not the kind that talks much, but the kind that shows up when it matters." The rain intensified, but neither of them moved. Cole's expression remained calm, but inside his mind was a storm of its own. He thought about the men who used to ride beside him, the ones who didn't make it back from their own wars, some on the battlefield, some after it. The world never called what happened to them a war, but it was. It was the quiet kind fought in the shadows of sleepless nights and memories that refused to fade. He thought of Eli, one of his closest brothers in the club, a veteran too, who'd taken his life 3 years ago after being turned away from a job interview for looking too rough. That memory had burned deep, and for years Cole carried it like an ember that refused to die. Looking at Jack now, hunched and defeated in the rain, he saw Eli's eyes all over again, the same mixture of pride and pain. And in that instant, Cole made his decision. He reached into his back pocket, pulled out his phone, and scrolled through his contacts until he found a number labeled simply Reaper. He pressed call. The line rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. "Yeah, it's Cole." There was a pause on the other end, then a slow chuckle. "You finally crawl out of whatever hole you've been in?" Cole didn't smile. "Got a situation," he said. "Need the crew." "What kind of situation?" "The kind that smells like disrespect." That was all he needed to say. In their world, disrespect toward a brother, or toward any man who'd worn the uniform, wasn't something to debate. It was something to correct. "Location?" the voice asked. Cole looked at the diner, its sign still buzzing faintly. "Maple Junction Diner off Route 19? The voice on the other end exhaled a slow, almost amused sigh. "Copy that. Give us 20. The line went dead. Cole slid the phone back into his pocket and sat down beside Jack, who was still staring at him like he couldn't quite figure him out. "You just called someone?" Jack asked. "Yeah," Cole said, his tone steady. "A few friends." Jack frowned. "You don't gotta do that for me." Cole looked out toward the road, where the horizon blurred into gray. "Not doing it for you," he said quietly. "Doing it because it's right." Those words hung in the air for a moment, simple but heavy. Behind them was the truth, that people like Cole didn't act out of pity. They acted out of code. The kind of code the world often forgets until someone breaks it. The rain finally eased, turning to a light drizzle that shimmered under the streetlights. Cars passed occasionally, their tires hissing against the wet pavement, but none of the drivers paid attention to the two men sitting by the curb. Jack pulled the jacket tighter around his shoulders. It smelled of oil, leather, and faintly of smoke. For some reason, it made him feel safe. "I used to have one like this," Jack said after a while, his voice distant. Before everything went sideways." Cole glanced at him. "What happened?" Jack took a deep breath, staring at the ground. "Got back from my second tour. Thought I'd start over. Had a place lined up. Job. But I guess I didn't fit in anymore. Too quiet. Too on edge. My girl left. Job fell through. Bills stacked up. Then one night I just stopped fighting. Stopped pretending I was fine." He rubbed his palms together, the rainwater mixing with old scars. "You ever get tired of trying to be the man you used to be?" Cole nodded slowly. "Every damn day." That was the moment their stories aligned, not in what they'd lost, but in what they still carried. Two men on different roads, both haunted by the same kind of silence. It wasn't about tragedy anymore. It was about recognition. The hum of an engine echoed faintly in the distance, growing louder by the second. Then another, and another. Jack's brow furrowed as he looked up. "What's that?" Cole smiled faintly, standing as the first headlight appeared down the long stretch of road. "That," he said, "is what happens when good men decide they've had enough of watching the world go to hell." Within minutes, the road was alive. Dozens of bikes cut through the mist, headlights blazing like comets. The sound rolled through the town, deep and unrelenting, rattling the diner windows. Inside, the owner looked up from the counter, his smug confidence flickering into confusion. He turned toward the window just as the first bikes began to fill his parking lot, chrome gleaming under the flickering neon. Jack stood slowly, disbelief etched on his face. "You called them? For me?" Cole shook his head. "No, I called them for us. The first riders. Dismounted, helmets coming off, revealing faces lined with age and stories. They weren't outlaws. They were fathers, veterans, welders and truckers, men who had lived enough life to know that silence sometimes feeds injustice. Their presence alone shifted the air, turning fear into reckoning. Inside the diner, the chatter stopped. People craned their necks to see what was happening. The waitress dropped her pen. The owner froze, his mouth slightly open as Cole pushed the door open once more and stepped inside, water dripping from his boots. The room was different now. The energy had shifted. The same people who had laughed minutes ago now sat perfectly still. Cole didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence carried weight. "You wouldn't serve one soldier," he said, eyes locked on the owner, "so we'll take his place." Outside, more bikers filed in, filling every booth and bar stool, the sound of their leather creaking like an echo of judgment. The waitress stood there, speechless. The owner tried to speak, but no words came. Cole turned his head slightly toward the window, where Jack stood under the awning, drenched but no longer invisible. "That man out there earned his meal 10 times over," Cole said, voice steady. "You couldn't see it, but we did." For a moment no one breathed. The rain against the glass was the only sound. Then Cole dropped a wad of cash on the counter. "Every plate in this place," he said, "paid in full." The bikers began to order, not out of hunger, but out of purpose. They filled the silence with calm conversation, their voices low but deliberate. No shouting, no threats, just presence, the kind that can't be ignored. Jack watched from outside, unsure whether to step in or stay where he was. For so long he'd been treated like a ghost, and now, for the first time, someone had made him visible again. He pressed his hand against his chest, feeling the cold dog tags against his skin. Something inside him stirred, an awakening of self-respect he thought was gone forever. He didn't know it yet, but that moment would mark the beginning of his transformation. It wasn't about revenge or even gratitude. It was about rediscovering the part of himself that believed the world could still be righted, one decision at a time. And as the sound of engines rumbled like thunder through the night, Cole glanced toward the horizon, his expression unreadable. He knew this wasn't just about a meal or a single act of cruelty. It was about the unseen battles people fight every day, the hidden truths behind quiet eyes, the small acts of defiance that change the course of a journey. The diner was no longer a place of shame. It had become a stage for revelation. And as justice settled quietly into the room, something much deeper began to unfold, something that would leave no one untouched by its echo. The air trembled before the sound arrived. It began as a faint vibration, barely noticeable, like the growl of a storm still miles away. But soon it swelled into something deeper, heavier, almost alive. The low rumble rolled over the hills, carried by the wind and amplified by the asphalt, until the entire town seemed to feel it through the soles of their shoes. Forks paused mid-air inside the diner, cups stopped halfway to mouths, conversations froze. Then someone near the window whispered, "What the hell is that?" The owner stepped forward, frowning, trying to see past the reflection in the glass. The rain had stopped, but mist hung over the road like smoke. Then headlights broke through it. First a few, then dozens, then an unending line of them, glowing white against the grey morning. The rumble deepened, layered and rhythmic, 1,000 pistons moving in unison. It wasn't chaos, it was coordination, a kind of music only the road understands. Jack Turner turned toward the sound, his expression caught between disbelief and awe. "Are they with you?" he asked quietly. Cole Dawson's gaze didn't leave the horizon. "They're with us." And then they came. The first wave of bikes appeared over the rise, chrome catching the light, engines thundering like drums in a procession. Riders wore the same black patch stitched on Cole's jacket, Iron Vows MC. To outsiders, it was just another biker club, maybe even one to be feared. But to those who knew them, that patch meant something sacred. Every stitch told a story of loyalty, loss, and brotherhood. They didn't ride for glory. They rode for the people, the world. Forgot. Engines echoed off the diner walls as the formation pulled in tight, row after row. The parking lot, moments ago nearly empty, filled with black and steel and power. The air was thick with exhaust and intention. Windows rattled. A sugar jar toppled off the counter. The waitress gasped and stepped back, her hand clutching the edge of the counter. Inside, a teenager muttered, "Mum, are they a gang?" His mother didn't answer. The owner's smug expression began to falter, his earlier confidence melting into something that looked a lot like fear. He reached for a towel, pretending to clean the counter again, but his hands were shaking. Outside, Cole removed his helmet and nodded once to the men who had arrived. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The moment his eyes met theirs, everything was understood. This wasn't a raid. It was a reckoning. Jack stood near the curb, still wearing the jacket Cole had given him. The heavy leather hung loosely on his shoulders, but it fit him in a way that nothing else had in years. The Iron Vows insignia across the back glistened under the headlights. One of the bikers, a tall man with grey in his beard, noticed it and gave a slow nod of respect. Jack didn't know him, but that look said everything. "You're one of us now." Cole walked up to him. "You good?" Jack hesitated, his voice unsteady. "I don't understand what's happening." "You don't have to," Cole said, his tone calm. "Just watch." The sound of the engines settled into a low idle, a collective heartbeat of chrome and thunder. Then, as if on cue, the riders began dismounting. Boots hit the pavement in synchronized rhythm. The ground seemed to pulse beneath their weight. Each man took off his helmet, revealing faces hardened by years but softened by purpose. There was no anger in their eyes, just certainty. Cole pushed open the diner door and stepped inside. The sudden quiet was deafening. All eyes turned to him. He walked to the counter, his boots leaving a trail of water on the tile. The owner tried to smile, but it looked more like a grimace. "Look, I don't want any trouble," he said quickly. Cole placed both hands on the counter and leaned in slightly. "You already made trouble," he said softly. "We're just here to balance it." The man blinked, glancing past Cole at the crowd of bikers now visible through the windows. You can't just come in here and—" Cole interrupted, his voice calm but unyielding. "We're not here to destroy anything. We're here to remind you of something you forgot." He turned his head toward the door. One of the bikers held it open as the others began filing in, dozens of them, taking every booth, every stool, every empty seat. The diner filled with the smell of wet leather and motor oil. The waitress stepped back, eyes wide but unafraid. There was something oddly reverent about it all, as though a sacred ritual was unfolding in front of her. Cole sat down at the same corner booth he had occupied earlier, the one where he'd watched Jack's humiliation. This time, he wasn't alone. A biker slid into the seat across from him, nodding toward the owner. "So, how are we doing this?" Cole's eyes flicked toward the man behind the counter. "Every meal on the menu. Everyone eats." The owner blinked, stunned. "You're kidding." Cole's tone didn't change. "Was I smiling?" the man stammered, looking around the room. The bikers had started placing their orders, burgers, pancakes, coffee. No one raised their voice. No one laughed. The silence was louder than any protest could have been. It was the sound of quiet accountability. Outside, Jack stood by the door, watching through the glass. The reflection of the neon sign shimmered across his face. He still couldn't believe what he was seeing. Hundreds of men showing up not for violence, not for vengeance, but for him. A man the world had discarded. He took a slow breath, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel heavy. It felt alive. Something inside him was shifting, a revelation he couldn't yet name. The idea that maybe he wasn't as forgotten as he'd believed, that one small act of cruelty could still awaken a movement of compassion. Inside, the waitress began to serve the tables, her hands shaking at first, but steadying as the atmosphere softened. The bikers spoke respectfully, thanking her for each plate. The owner, still behind the counter, looked around helplessly as the cash register filled with tips, more than he'd probably seen in weeks. Cole picked up his coffee and took a sip, his gaze steady on the man across from him. "You could have just poured him a cup," he said quietly. "Would have cost you $2. But the thing about decisions like that, they don't disappear. They echo." The owner swallowed hard. "You're trying to scare me?" No, Cole said, setting the cup down. I'm trying to teach you. A murmur spread through the diner. Low conversation, quiet laughter. The tension began to dissolve, replaced by something that felt almost sacred. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about balance. Every plate that landed on a table was an offering to decency. Every fork that scraped against a dish, a reminder that kindness isn't weakness. It's power, hidden beneath restraint. Jack finally stepped inside, hesitant at first. The bikers looked up and nodded to him one by one. A few even stood as he passed, not out of pity, but respect. Cole motioned for him to sit. "Come on," he said. "You've earned this." Jack sat down across from him, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know what to say," Cole smirked. "You don't need to say anything, just eat." Jack laughed softly, shaking his head. "You guys don't even know me." "Doesn't matter," Cole replied. "We know enough." The owner's wife, who had been hiding near the kitchen door, finally stepped forward. Her eyes glistened as she approached Jack with a plate, eggs, toast, bacon, and a steaming cup of coffee. She placed it gently in front of him and whispered, "I didn't know." Jack looked up, meeting her gaze. "Now you do." The words weren't bitter. They were simple, almost freeing. A small act of forgiveness that carried more strength than anger ever could. As Jack ate, Cole leaned back in his seat, watching the room transform. What had started as a scene of humiliation had become a quiet testament to humanity's potential for change. He thought about how easily cruelty spreads, but also how powerful one decision can be when it comes from the right place. That's the hidden truth most people miss. Transformation doesn't always roar in grand gestures. Sometimes it rides in on the steady hum of engines and the weight of a shared conscience. Outside, the rain had stopped completely. The clouds broke just enough for sunlight to slip through, catching the chrome of the motorcycles and scattering light across the diner windows. Jack noticed it first. He smiled faintly. "Looks like the storm's passing." Cole nodded. "Yeah," he said, "but some storms are worth remembering." And though the sound of the engines had quieted, their echo lingered in the air, a vibration that carried further than anyone inside that diner could imagine, rippling outward like a living memory. For Jack, it was the moment his story turned, a revelation disguised as an act of defiance, proof that even the smallest spark of decency could ignite something unstoppable. The morning rolled on, but time inside that diner seemed to slow. The noise, the smell, the warmth, they became more than a moment. They became a message, one that didn't need words to be understood. And as the bikers finished their meals in calm, collected silence, something unspoken lingered between them all, a promise that this wouldn't be the last time compassion rode out to meet injustice on the open road. Cole stood at the entrance of the diner, the glass door swinging slowly behind him. The sound of the rain now replaced by the low hum of engines idling outside. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow over the crowd of uneasy customers. Every eye in the room shifted toward him as he stepped forward, water dripping from the ends of his gloves onto the checkered floor. He held his helmet under one arm, his gaze steady, his steps deliberate, like a man who had no need to explain what everyone already understood. He stopped at the center of the room, the silence so heavy it pressed against the walls. The owner stood frozen behind the counter, his hand still resting on the coffee pot, as if holding it could shield him from what was about to unfold. Cole's voice, when it came, was quiet, calm enough to make the air tremble. "You wouldn't serve one soldier," he said, "so we'll take his place." The words fell into the room like stones into still water, rippling through the uneasy hush. Behind Cole, the door opened again, and the first wave of bikers walked in. They didn't speak. They didn't glare. They simply filled the diner in calm formation, moving with the kind of composure that comes from discipline, not rage. Boots thudded against tile, leather creaked softly, and one by one 200 men and women, veterans, truckers, mechanics, fathers, took their seats. The owner's face paled. "Now wait a second," he stammered. "I didn't mean—" Cole raised a hand lightly, not to silence him, but to remind him that silence already owned the room. "You said enough," he replied. "Now we're saying what you didn't." He nodded once toward the waitress, who stood, frozen by the counter, wide-eyed but trembling less now. "Ma'am," he said with quiet respect, "we'd like to order breakfast for everyone here. Full plates. Coffee all around." She blinked, processing what she'd just heard, then nodded slowly and began moving. One by one, the bikers handed her menus, polite, patient, deliberate. The sound of voices didn't rise above a murmur. The smell of sizzling bacon filled the air again, mixing with the faint scent of rain that drifted through the open door. Outside, Jack stood in the drizzle, watching through the fogged glass. From his vantage point, it looked like a dream, surreal, cinematic, too heavy with emotion to be real. His jacket, Cole's jacket, clung to his shoulders, heavy with meaning. He felt the vibration of the engines through the pavement under his boots, a deep rhythm that somehow synced with his heartbeat. He whispered under his breath, almost to himself, "They really came." Inside, the waitress placed the first few plates on the tables. The bikers waited until everyone had food before lifting a fork. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't even protest. It was reverence, an unspoken code written in action rather than words. Each plate of food was a declaration. Each dollar tip left on the counter, a quiet sentence in a much larger story. The owner's wife emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, her eyes darting nervously between the bikers and her husband. She approached Cole, voice shaking. Is this about, the man who was here earlier?" Cole turned to her, his gaze softening. "It's about what happens when decency costs nothing, but someone still refuses to pay the price." Her expression changed. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The look of someone who had been pretending not to know the truth, but could no longer escape it. She turned toward the window and saw Jack standing outside, his breath fogging the glass. Something in her face broke, a small but unmistakable fracture between guilt and compassion. She walked out from behind the counter, ignoring the look her husband shot her, and went to the door. Opening it gently, she called out to Jack, her voice catching in her throat. "Sir?" Jack turned, surprised. She held out a plate wrapped in a towel to keep it warm. "I didn't know," she said softly. I should have said something." Jack hesitated, glancing back at Cole, who gave him a small nod. Taking the plate, he said quietly, "It's okay. Now you do." Those words, simple, almost whispered, carried more weight than any sermon could. They hung in the damp air like a confession, dissolving the last of the tension that had poisoned the morning. She nodded, tears glinting under the diner lights, and went back inside without another word. Cole watched the exchange, his jaw tightening just slightly before he turned back toward the counter. "It's not about revenge," he said, his voice level, his tone more weary than angry. "It's about respect. That man outside wore a uniform once. You didn't have to salute him, you just had to serve him." The owner stared down at the floor. For the first time since Cole had walked in, he didn't have an answer. The arrogance that had painted his face earlier was gone, replaced by something heavier, self-awareness. He fumbled for a response, but nothing came. The silence around him had shifted. It wasn't threatening anymore, it was reflective. The sound of forks against plates, the faint clink of glasses, the low hum of conversation, all of it blended into something strangely peaceful. It wasn't a punishment, it was a correction, a moral recalibration disguised as a meal. One of the younger bikers, a woman with short hair and a scar across her cheek, looked up from her plate and met the owner's gaze. "You know," she said quietly, "my dad came home from Nam and used to sit in diners just like this. Sometimes people thanked him, most times they didn't, but he never stopped believing in good people. Guess we just want to make sure that belief wasn't wasted." The owner didn't reply, but his throat tightened. His hands shook slightly as he refilled coffee cups, one by one, for the very people whose presence had terrified him minutes ago. No one mocked him, no one gloated. They simply let him feel the weight of what he'd done and what he could choose to do differently next time. Jack finally stepped inside, guided by the smell of coffee and the quiet hum of conversation. As he entered, the room seemed to pause again, but this time not out of discomfort but acknowledgement. Heads turned, some nodded. One biker, his hands tattooed with faded names, stood and offered Jack his seat. Jack hesitated, unsure what to do. Cole spoke gently. "Sit down, Marine." Jack took the seat, still holding the plate the owner's wife had given him. The smell of fresh food hit him, and for a brief moment it felt like home, a memory of mornings long gone, before things had fallen apart. He took a slow bite, the warmth spreading through him in a way he hadn't felt in years. Cole watched him eat, his expression unreadable but softened. The man had seen enough pain to know that redemption rarely arrives with applause. It arrives quietly, humbly, in the small act of someone regaining their dignity. The waitress came by again, setting another cup of coffee on Jack's table. "It's on the house," she said shyly. Jack looked up, his voice gentle. "Thank you." Cole leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. The diner buzzed softly around him, the smell of coffee, the scrape of forks, the occasional chuckle of conversation. He knew this moment wouldn't make the news. It wouldn't go viral, but it would matter. Somewhere, deep inside every person in that room, a seed had been planted, the kind that forces you to confront who you are when no one's watching. The sun had begun to pierce through the clouds outside, its light slipping through the blinds in golden streaks across the floor. The motorcycles gleamed under it like polished silver. Jack looked toward the window, the reflection of his own face blending with the iron vows patch on his borrowed jacket. It was symbolic, yes, but also grounding. It reminded him that even when you've lost everything, sometimes all it takes is one act of unexpected kindness to start over. He turned to Cole, his voice low. "You didn't have to do all this for me." Cole smirked faintly. "Didn't do it for you, brother. Did it because someday someone did it for me." That line landed between them like truth itself, unpolished, raw, and undeniable. It wasn't about heroism, it was about cycle and continuity. One man stands when another falls, and that's how decency survives the decay of indifference. As the meal wound down, the bikers began leaving tips on their tables, large bills folded neatly beneath napkins, quiet gestures that spoke louder than speeches. The owner watched, eyes red-rimmed, unable to look anyone directly in the face. When Cole stood to leave, he reached for his helmet, pausing only long enough to glance back at the man behind the counter. "You'll think about this," he said. "Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but one day, when someone else walks in hungry and worn down, you'll remember today. And you'll make a different decision." The owner nodded faintly, words failing him again. Cole didn't need a reply. Some lessons were meant to echo in silence. Outside, the engines began to roar back to life, their collective growl shaking the windows once more. But now the sound carried something else with it, a sense of restoration, of balance restored. The people inside the diner would talk about this day for years, not out of fear, but out of the strange, transformative beauty of witnessing justice, delivered not through violence, but through dignity. Jack followed Cole to the door, the sunlight spilling across his face as he stepped back into the world. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel invisible. The jacket was still heavy on his shoulders, but now it felt less like borrowed armor and more like belonging. And as the engines thundered back to life, Cole swung a leg over his bike and glanced back toward the diner. He didn't smile, didn't wave. He simply looked, a long, quiet look that said everything words couldn't. The kind of look that lingers in the mind of anyone who's ever been forced to confront who they are when faced with their own reflection. The convoy began to move, tires rolling through, puddles, sunlight gleaming off chrome. The noise faded slowly into the distance, leaving behind the soft chime of the diner's doorbell and a silence filled not with guilt, but with the quiet possibility of change. The kind that doesn't happen all at once, but begins in moments like these, when pride meets truth and truth refuses to look away. The sunlight cut through the clouds in streaks, glinting off the chrome bikes lined across the parking lot like a silent army. The sound of forks against plates drifted from inside the diner. A steady rhythm, calm and deliberate, nothing like the chaos that had filled the air moments before. Justice had arrived not in shouts or violence, but in presence, and that presence had changed the temperature of everything around it. Inside, the owner stood stiff behind the counter, his white apron now smudged with nervous sweat. His hands, once quick and sure as they cleaned tables and poured coffee, now fumbled with a rag that he didn't really need. He couldn't seem to stop wiping the same spot over and over again, as if he could scrub away the moment that had just redefined him. The laughter that once filled the diner felt like it had never existed. Now there was only reflection, quiet, awkward, unspoken reflection. His wife watched him from the kitchen doorway. She had been married to him for 20 years, long enough to know that pride was his armor, and arrogance his favorite disguise. But what she saw in his face now wasn't pride. It was confusion, the kind that comes when a man finally sees himself clearly, stripped of excuses. She didn't say a word. Instead, she reached for a clean plate, filled it with food, eggs, toast, a generous serving of hash browns, and covered it with a napkin to keep it warm. The act was small, but her hands trembled as she did it, like she knew it was something more than just breakfast. It was a decision, a shift, the first step toward something softer, something truer. Outside, Jack sat on the curb. Again, the same spot where humiliation had first anchored him to the pavement. The rain had stopped completely now, leaving a faint shimmer on the asphalt that reflected the bikes, the diner, and fragments of sunlight. He held the jacket tight against his chest, still half afraid to believe that all this was real. For years, he had learned not to expect kindness. Life had taught him that hope was a fragile thing, easily broken, rarely repaired. But at that moment, he felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the jacket or the sun. He heard the diner door open and turned slightly. The owner's wife stepped out, holding the plate carefully in both hands. Her steps were hesitant at first, but each one grew firmer, steadier as she crossed the parking lot. When she reached him, she didn't meet his eyes right away. She simply held out the plate and said, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, "I didn't know." Jack blinked, taken aback by the simplicity of the words. No excuses, no explanations, just truth. He looked at her for a long moment before replying, "You do now." It wasn't anger in his voice. It wasn't even forgiveness. It was something more profound, a quiet acknowledgement that even pain, when met with humility, can turn into understanding. The kind of exchange that transforms both people, even if neither realizes it fully yet. The woman nodded, her eyes glistening as she handed him the plate. Then she turned back toward the diner, her shoulders shaking. Slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of seeing something she could no longer unsee. Inside, the owner caught a glimpse of her through the window. He watched her set her hand on the doorframe for balance before walking back to the counter. When she met his eyes, she didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The look she gave him said everything. You crossed a line, and now you have to decide what kind of man you're going to be. For the first time, he couldn't hide behind excuses. The mirror was right in front of him, held up not by his wife, but by 200 strangers who had done nothing but sit down and eat. That silence, that composure, it was a reflection of everything he had failed to be that morning. He turned toward Cole, who was finishing his meal in the corner booth, helmet resting beside him. Cole caught his gaze, unreadable as ever. The owner tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. I made a mistake," he finally said, the words scraping out like gravel. Cole nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Yeah," he said, "but it's not the first time someone's made one. The question is what you do next." The words hit harder than any threat could have. They weren't about punishment. They were about possibility. Redemption doesn't come from running. It comes from facing what you've done, from letting humility replace pride. The owner's shoulders slumped. For the first time, he looked smaller. "I didn't think it mattered," he admitted. "Just one man, one meal." Cole leaned back, crossing his arms. "It always matters," he said quietly. "That's the hidden truth most people don't want to see. The way you treat one person when nobody's watching. That's who you really are." The owner dropped his gaze, his hands tightening around the counter's edge. He wasn't a cruel man, not in the way villains are in stories. He was just ordinary, caught in the slow erosion of empathy that happens when people stop seeing each other as human. But standing there, surrounded by the weight of what he'd done, he realized how far that small blindness could reach. He looked toward the door again. Through the window, he saw Jack sitting outside, eating the meal his wife had brought him. The man didn't look broken anymore. He looked steady, grounded, as if the earth itself had shifted beneath him. Something cracked open inside the diner owner, a fracture between the man he'd been and the man he could still become. He didn't say anything, but his silence had changed. It wasn't defensive anymore. It was listening. The waitress approached with the check, her hand trembling slightly as she set it down in front of Cole. "You guys already paid more than enough," she said softly. "The register's full." Cole nodded. "Good. Let it stay that way." She smiled nervously, glancing at the owner. "He's not usually like this," she whispered. Cole looked at her, his expression patient but firm. "Maybe not, but the world doesn't remember who we were on our best days. It remembers who we were when someone needed us most." The waitress nodded, the truth of that sinking in. Around them, the bikers finished their meals in the same quiet harmony. Some smiled at the waitress as they left. Others offered a nod to the owner, not in mockery, but in acknowledgement. They weren't there to humiliate him. They were there to leave a mark, to remind him that the difference between cruelty and compassion is a decision made in seconds. Outside, Jack was finishing his meal, savoring each bite, like it was the first real food he'd had in weeks. The sun was breaking fully through the clouds now, the warmth touching his face. He felt lighter, not because of what had been done for him, but because of what it had revealed. That decency hadn't died out. It had just been hiding behind fear and judgment. Cole stepped outside and stood next to him, his helmet tucked under his arm. They didn't speak at first. They just watched as the last of the bikers mounted their rides, the sound of engines warming up again, filling the air like distant thunder. Finally, Jack spoke. "You think he'll change?" Cole looked toward the diner, where the owner now stood alone at the window, his expression unreadable, but softer. "Maybe," he said. "Change doesn't always happen fast. Sometimes it starts with guilt. Sometimes it starts with shame. But if a man's got a conscience, it'll get through eventually." Jack nodded slowly. "Feels strange. I thought I wanted him to suffer, but now..." Cole finished the thought for him. "Now you just want him to understand." Jack looked down, smiling faintly. "Yeah, guess that's it." That was the quiet miracle of moments like this, the kind that unfold not in fury but in understanding. What had started as an act of retribution was turning into something more, something that couldn't be measured in money or pride. It was transformation, the kind that begins behind the scenes, deep inside people who never thought they were capable of it. The last of the engines, revved, echoing across the open highway. Cole reached out, clapping Jack lightly on the shoulder. "You ready?" Jack raised an eyebrow. "For what?" Cole smirked. "For the next part of the journey." Jack glanced at the line of bikes, the men and women waiting patiently for Cole's signal. For a brief second he hesitated, unsure if he belonged there. But then he looked down at the jacket he was wearing, the iron vows patch reflecting sunlight, and felt something he hadn't in years: belonging. He stood, brushing the dust from his jeans, and nodded. "Yeah, I'm ready." Cole smiled faintly, sliding on his helmet. "Then let's ride." The engines roared to life, louder now, filling the air with a sound that was both final and promising. The kind of sound that follows transformation, the kind that marks the end of one story and the quiet beginning of another. As they pulled out of the lot, the diner grew smaller in the mirrors, but its impact lingered. Inside, the owner sat at the counter, staring at the empty plate where Jack's meal had been. For the first time, he didn't feel powerful or proud. He felt aware, and awareness, though uncomfortable, is the first step toward redemption. Outside, the road stretched endlessly ahead, glistening in the sunlight. Cole led the pack, Jack close behind. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The road had its own language, and somewhere between the hum of engines and the wind against their faces, something unspoken bound them, a shared revelation that justice without compassion is hollow, and compassion without courage is incomplete. The world around them blurred, the horizon widening, and in that quiet, endless motion, their journey continued, not toward vengeance, but toward healing, where forgiveness would find its place in the echo of thunder and the rhythm of the open road. The engines had settled into a low, unified hum, like a chorus breathing in rhythm with the wind. The road stretched ahead, long and golden under the afternoon sun, cutting through endless fields that shimmered with heat. Dust swirled in soft spirals behind the motorcycles as they moved in formation, tight and purposeful, the sound of the convoy echoing off the distant hills. It wasn't noise anymore. It was communion, a statement, a living reminder that loyalty and justice could still roar louder than indifference. Cole rode at the front, his posture calm, the kind of stillness that comes from knowing where you belong. Behind him, Jack kept pace. The leather jacket clung to him, heavy with rain and meaning, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel borrowed. It felt earned. Every gust of wind that brushed his face seemed to whisper the same message. You're still here. You still matter. They rode for miles without speaking. Words weren't necessary. The rhythm of the engines and the road said everything that needed to be said. For Jack, each passing mile felt like a page turning, a chapter of shame and invisibility closing, quietly behind him. He wasn't sure where they were headed, and he didn't ask. All he knew was that he didn't want to stop. When the group finally pulled over, it was near an old roadside rest area, a place long forgotten by travelers but familiar to the Iron Vows. The lot was cracked and overgrown with weeds, but to them it was sacred ground. The air still carried the faint scent of oil, smoke, and memory. They parked in formation, one after another, the noise fading into the kind of silence that feels like respect. Cole dismounted first, stretching his legs, before glancing back at Jack. "Come here," he said. His voice wasn't commanding. It was an invitation. Jack hesitated but obeyed, walking slowly toward him. The other bikers stood nearby, some lighting cigarettes, others watching quietly, their faces unreadable but kind. Cole reached into one of the saddlebags of his bike and pulled out something wrapped in a black cloth. He unrolled it carefully, revealing a leather vest with a patch on the back, the Iron Vows emblem, stitched in silver thread that caught the sunlight. Jack froze. That's your colors," he said softly, as if afraid the words might break something sacred. Cole nodded. "They were mine," he replied. "Now they're yours." Jack stared at the vest, his throat tightening. "I'm not one of you," he whispered. Cole stepped closer, placing the vest in his hands. "You served once," he said. "You still serve." The words hit harder than any speech could have. They weren't about pity or charity. They were about identity, recognition, the acknowledgement that Jack's worth hadn't vanished with his fortune or his home or his uniform. It had only been waiting to be seen again. Jack looked down at the vest, his reflection flickering across the chrome of the nearest bike. The leather was worn but cared for, the stitching strong, the scent familiar, the same smell that used to fill barracks after long patrols, sweat, earth, and belonging. He could feel the weight of it in his hands, not as a gift but as a responsibility. His voice trembled. "I don't deserve this." Cole smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried both pain and pride. "None of us did when we started. You earn it by showing up. You did that today." The rest of the crew stood silent, watching. One of the older bikers, a man with silver hair and tattoos fading into wrinkles, stepped forward and placed a hand on Jack's shoulder. "You got brothers now," he said. "That means when the world forgets you, we don't." Jack's eyes glistened. He tried to speak but couldn't. His breath hitched and he looked away, blinking hard. For years, he had carried the weight of invisibility, the shame of being seen as less than, of having served a country that no longer saw him. But in that moment, surrounded by men who looked like outlaws but acted like saints, he felt something rebuild inside him. Not pride, not even hope. Something quieter. Dignity. He slipped the vest over his shoulders. It fit better than he expected. The leather molded to him as if it had been waiting all this time. Cole adjusted the collar for him, patting it once before stepping back. "There," he said. "Looks right on you." The group cheered. Not loud, not wild, but in a way that filled the air with warmth. A few clapped him on the back. Someone handed him a cup of coffee from a thermos. Another tossed him a small patch with the words, "Never forgotten," stitched in red. It wasn't ceremony. It was welcome. Jack looked at them all, his voice low but clear. "I don't know how to thank you." Cole shook his head. "You don't. You just ride." Jack laughed softly through the tears he tried to hide. The sound carried across the empty lot, blending with the faint rustle of wind through the grass. He hadn't laughed like that in years. It felt strange, but it also felt right. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in orange and gold, the Iron Vows began to mount their bikes again. Jack followed their lead. His hand steady on the handlebars. He didn't know their destinations, but he didn't need to. Sometimes the journey itself was enough, a road without a map, guided by purpose instead of direction. Cole rode beside him now, not ahead. He turned his head slightly and said over the rumble of the engines, "You ever wonder why we call ourselves the Iron Vows?" Jack shook his head. "Can't say I've thought about it." Cole's gaze stayed fixed on the horizon. "Because everything else breaks," he said. "Bones, promises, systems, people, but vows, the ones made with the soul, they don't. They bend, they rust, but they don't break." The words stayed with Jack as they started moving again. The pack rode in formation, the sound of their engines echoing through the valley. The air was cooler now, carrying that distinct smell of dust and gasoline that only riders understand, a scent that feels like freedom mixed with consequence. For a while, Jack let himself drift in thought. He thought of the man he used to be, the one who wore a different kind of uniform, who believed service ended when the mission did. Now he understood it differently. Service wasn't about orders. It was about integrity, the decision to stand up even when no one's watching, even when you've been broken. He thought, too, about the owner of the diner, the way the man's arrogance had cracked under the weight of truth. Jack didn't hate him anymore. He pitied him, because sometimes the real punishment isn't shame. It's the realization of how close you came to being decent and how easily you failed yourself. The sky began to darken, the first hints of twilight folding over the horizon. The group took a turn onto an old highway that cut through open fields. The wind hit harder now, colder, sharper, but it felt alive. Jack closed his eyes for a moment, letting it wash over him. It was more than just motion. It was transformation, a quiet shedding of everything that had chained him to his past. When he opened them, again, he saw Cole glance his way. There was pride in the man's eyes, but also something else, relief. Maybe because Cole saw a part of himself in Jack, and helping him was like healing a wound he'd carried too long. At the next stop, they pulled into a gas station that hadn't seen a customer all day. The old neon sign flickered, and the distant sound of a train echoed somewhere beyond the trees. They filled their tanks in silence, the glow of the pumps painting their jackets in shades of amber. Jack leaned against his bike, staring at the horizon. Cole walked over, wiping grease from his hands. "You ride pretty well for someone who looks like he's been walking for years," he teased lightly. Jack smirked. "Guess it's like muscle memory. You never really forget." Cole nodded, his expression softening. "That's the thing about the road," he said. "It doesn't judge where you've been. It only cares if you keep going." Jack thought about that for a long time after. It wasn't just about motorcycles. It was about life itself, about the mindset it takes to start again after you've lost everything. The courage to get back on your feet when no one's clapping, when no one believes you can. That was the real journey, the one most people never see, the one that happens behind the scenes, between the failures and the rebirth. As the night crept closer, the sky turned from gold to deep blue. The first stars appeared, faint at first, then bolder as the sun finally surrendered. The engines came alive again, one by one, and the road stretched ahead like a promise, one made not of guarantees but of possibility. Cole put on his helmet and glanced at Jack one more time. "You know what's funny?" he said, his voice muffled through the visor. "The world thinks we're the outlaws, but maybe we're just the last ones still keeping our word." Jack smiled beneath his own helmet, the rumble of his bike vibrating through his chest. "Then let's make sure they never forget it." They rolled out. Together, the roar of their engines rising against the night like a heartbeat shared between brothers. And somewhere deep inside that sound, beneath the steel, beneath the leather, beneath the dust of 1,000 miles, was a truth that didn't need to be spoken. Dignity doesn't return with pity. It returns with respect, with action, with the quiet courage of those who refuse to let another soul be left behind. The lights of the diner had long disappeared behind them, but its memory burned steady in their wake. A story of transformation that would ripple far beyond that small town, carried in the echo of 200 engines fading into the horizon, where justice and compassion rode side by side, and the night was wide open for the road ahead. The highway stretched endlessly under a pale morning sky, its edges blurred by heat and dust. The world seemed quiet again, so quiet that the sound of the engines almost felt like breathing. Cole rode up front, his shadow long and lean on the asphalt, while Jack followed close behind, still learning the rhythm of the road. The convoy had thinned, a few riders had peeled off toward their own destinations, but the essence of what had happened back at that small-town diner lingered in the air, traveling with them like an invisible passenger. There's something about silence after chaos. It reveals things noise usually hides. It's in that quiet, when people start to realize what they've done, who they've become, and what kind of stories they've written in other people's lives without even knowing it. That's what lingered now. The awareness that every choice leaves a trace, that every cruel word or kind gesture has an afterlife of its own. As the bikes cruised along the open road, Jack's eyes wandered over the horizon. The land seemed endless, yet strangely intimate. It was the same America he had fought for, the fields, the diners, the roads, but seen from a new perspective. Not as a soldier defending borders, but as a man rediscovering what humanity actually meant within them. He thought of the owner's face, the arrogance first, then the guilt, and finally that fragile look of realization. That moment had replayed in his head again and again, not because of the insult, but because of what came after. The apology had never been spoken, but he'd seen it in the man's eyes. Sometimes redemption isn't loud. It doesn't come with fireworks or speeches. It comes in the shape of silence, the kind that follows a mistake you can't forget. Cole broke formation slightly, riding alongside Jack. "You're quiet," he said over the wind. Jack smiled faintly. "Guess I've got a lot to think about." Cole nodded, eyes still fixed on the road ahead. "Thinking's good. Just don't get stuck in it. Reflection's supposed to move you forward, not trap you where you were." The words sank in deeper than Jack expected. He'd spent years trapped, inside memories, inside regret, inside the walls of his own invisibility. For so long, he'd mistaken survival for living. But something about this journey, about what had just happened, was shifting that mindset. It was subtle, like the slow turning of a tide. The group stopped at a gas station on the outskirts of a small town. A worn American flag flapped above the pumps, its colors faded but proud. Cole dismounted first, stretching his back, then looked over at Jack. "Fill her up," he said, tossing him a few bills, "and grab yourself a drink inside." Jack nodded and walked toward the convenience store. Inside, the air smelled of motor oil, old coffee, and dust. The cashier, a young guy with earbuds in, didn't even look up as Jack placed a bottle of water on the counter. But as he reached for his wallet, something caught his eye, a small sign taped near the register. It read, "Veterans get 50% off. Thank you for your service." He stared at it for a moment, a strange lump forming in his throat. It wasn't about the discount, it was about being seen, even by a stranger who didn't know his name. He paid quietly, took his change, and walked back outside, his thoughts caught somewhere between gratitude and disbelief. Cole was leaning against his bike, arms crossed, watching the highway like a man who'd learned to read stories in the wind. "Funny thing about people," he said when Jack handed him the change. "They're always louder about hate than kindness. But that doesn't mean kindness isn't out there. It's just quieter." Jack nodded. "Yeah," he said softly. "I guess the quiet ones do the heavy lifting." Cole grinned. "Always have." They mounted their bikes again, engines roaring back to life, but beneath the noise was something softer, a current of reflection, almost meditative. The road ahead wasn't just asphalt and direction. It was a metaphor for the human journey itself. You ride through darkness, through storms, through stretches where nothing makes sense. But if you keep going long enough, light always finds a way to cut through. The wind whipped against their jackets as they accelerated. The Iron Vows patch on Jack's back caught the sunlight, gleaming like a promise. Every mile they rode together felt like another layer of his old life peeling away, replaced by something cleaner, truer. He didn't need medals or titles anymore. What mattered now was impact, the kind that isn't recorded but remembered. As they approached a bridge overlooking a quiet river, Cole slowed down and motioned for Jack to pull over. They parked side by side, the water below glinting like liquid glass. For a while neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the ticking of cooling engines and the distant hum of crickets. Then Cole said, "You know what gets me? People think the world's divided between the good guys and the bad. But it's not. It's divided between those who act and those who look away." Jack looked at him, thoughtful. "You think what we did back there made a difference?" Cole shrugged. "Maybe not to the world, but it made a difference to one man. And sometimes that's all it takes." Jack considered that. The owner would probably wake up tomorrow and still run his diner, still serve coffee, still wipe counters like he always had. But something in him would be different now, something fundamental. He'd think twice before judging another person by their clothes or their scars, and maybe that small change would ripple outward, one customer at a time. That's how transformation really works, not in grand gestures, but in quiet shifts. Cole threw a pebble into the river, watching the ripples spread outward. "You know," he said, "people see us riding and think we're running from something. But the truth is, most of us are chasing something. Peace, redemption, a reason to still believe." Jack smiled faintly. "Guess we found a little of that today." Cole's voice softened. "Yeah. But peace ain't permanent. You gotta keep choosing it every damn day." The simplicity of that truth hit hard. It wasn't just about bikes or brotherhood. It was about life itself. Every day, every decision was a chance to either make things right or let them rot. The difference was always in the mindset, in the choice to act rather than stand by. They stayed by the river a while longer, the sky deepening into gold. When the time came to ride again, Cole turned to Jack. "You ready?" Jack grinned. More than ever. They kicked their engines to life, the roar rising like thunder again, but now it carried a different tone. It wasn't anger or defiance. It was freedom, the sound of men who had nothing to prove, only something to protect. As they rode into the fading light, the landscape began to shift again, fields giving way to mountains in the distance. The colors of the sky bled from orange to purple, the kind of beauty that demands silence. Cole's earlier words lingered in Jack's mind. The world isn't divided between good and bad. It's divided between those who act and those who look away. That line replayed like an echo, a reminder of everything that had unfolded. It was the hidden truth beneath the noise. Empathy isn't weakness, and strength isn't cruelty. Real strength is measured by restraint, by the ability to meet hatred without becoming it. Jack thought about all the people who had watched in that diner, frozen between discomfort and indifference. Maybe some of them had learned something too. Maybe they'd tell their families about the day 100 bikers walked in not to start a fight, but to teach a lesson no one would forget. That's the thing about impact. You never see the full extent of it. It travels quietly, invisibly, long after the moment has passed. Cole's voice broke through the wind, calm and reflective. You know, the world calls us rough, says we're the kind of men you cross the street to avoid. But maybe that's why we're needed, because mercy doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it rides on 2 wheels. Jack couldn't help but smile under his helmet. Guess kindness has its own engine. Cole laughed, the sound carried away by the wind. Damn right it does. They accelerated, the bikes gliding like shadows across the open highway. The night began to rise around them, but neither man feared the darkness anymore. They understood now that even the darkest road has its own kind of light, one made not of headlights or stars, but of people who choose to do right when no one's watching. And somewhere behind them, in that little diner on the edge of nowhere, a man stood staring out at the empty parking lot. The plates were cleared, the tables wiped clean, but the memory of what had happened lingered like an imprint. He didn't understand it fully yet, but he felt it. The shift inside him, small but undeniable. He poured himself a cup of coffee, sat down and whispered, I didn't know. Maybe that's how real change begins, not with a roar, but with a whisper. Not with shame, but with awareness. The kind that catches you off guard and forces you to see the world differently. As the road stretched endlessly ahead, Cole and Jack disappeared into the horizon. 2 silhouettes against a canvas of twilight. The sound of their engines faded slowly into the distance, until there was only quiet again. But beneath that quiet, the message remained, strong and unshakable. In a world quick to judge, kindness can ride in many forms, and sometimes the loudest acts of mercy come from those the world fears most. The sun was sinking low, painting the horizon in molten streaks of orange and gold that shimmered across the open highway. The air had that weightless stillness that comes right before dusk, the kind of moment when the world feels suspended between endings and beginnings. The engines came to life one by one, deep, resonant, synchronized like the heartbeat of something larger than the men who rode them. The iron vows lined up with precision, their formation tight, their purpose clear. And in the middle of that line, Jack Turner sat astride a bike for the first time in years. Cole watched from the front, adjusting his gloves as the wind caught the edges of his jacket. Keep close, he said over his shoulder. We ride together. Jack nodded, his expression steady but his hands trembling slightly on the handlebars. He wasn't afraid, not of the speed, not of the road, but of the feeling rising in his chest. It was the unfamiliar weight of belonging. The engines roared louder, echoing through the fading light. Birds scattered from the telephone wires. The diner, the place where everything had changed, grew smaller in the rearview mirrors until it was nothing but a speck, a memory swallowed by distance. The convoy moved as one body, chrome glinting under the sun's last light, the rumble of 200 motorcycles filling the air like thunder made of purpose. Inside the diner, the owner stood at the window, watching the group disappear into the horizon. His reflection stared back at him, tired, older, but no longer blind. He didn't move for a long time, his coffee growing, cold in his hand. Somewhere inside him, something had shifted, a quiet revelation that didn't demand words or applause. He turned off the neon sign and whispered to himself, I didn't know, but this time it wasn't an excuse. It was a promise to never forget. Out on the road, the wind grew cooler. The sun began to dip behind the hills. setting the sky ablaze with color. The line of bikers cut through it like a living silhouette, symbols of redemption, proof that justice doesn't always wear a badge or a suit. Sometimes it rides with scars and leather, carrying stories instead of sermons. Jack found himself riding in rhythm with the others, his nerves slowly giving way to instinct. The road curved ahead, long and smooth, the kind of stretch that makes you feel like the world might actually make sense again. He exhaled, a slow, shaky breath, realizing that for the first time in years, he wasn't running from his past. He was riding through it. The sound of the engines wasn't noise anymore. It was therapy, thunder disguised as forgiveness. Cole glanced in his side mirror and saw Jack keeping pace. He smiled beneath his helmet. "You're doing good," he called out over the wind. Jack laughed, the sound carried away by the rush of air. "Feels like I'm remembering something I didn't know I'd lost." "That's what the road does," Cole replied. "It gives back what the world tried to take." They rode through small towns, past gas stations and shuttered motels, through stretches of farmland where families came out onto porches to watch the procession go by. Some waved, some just stared, unsure whether to be afraid or in awe. But there was something undeniable about the sight, something magnetic. It wasn't just the noise or the spectacle, it was the unity, the way every rider seemed to move as one, steady and unbreakable. In the middle of the group, Jack felt the rhythms settle into his bones. He looked to his left and right, faces weathered by wind and life, men and women who had seen things they'd rather forget, but still chose to show up for others. The thought hit him like a quiet revelation. Maybe this was what strength really looked like. Not the absence of pain, but the courage to carry it with grace. He thought about the diner owner again, about the way cruelty can grow from fear and how compassion can dismantle it in seconds. One decision had exposed a hidden truth, that empathy and dignity are not privileges, they're responsibilities, and sometimes all it takes to remind the world of that is a single act of defiance wrapped in kindness. As they rode on, the scenery changed, fields turning to forest, light turning to shadow. The pack moved like a wave, rising and falling with the bends of the road. Cole led the way, his posture steady, his focus unbroken. But behind the calm was reflection, the same kind that hits every man who's seen too much of the world's darkness. He thought about how thin the line really is between cruelty and compassion, how easy it is to forget that the two often live side by side in the same heart. The deeper they went into the evening, the more the landscape seemed to shift into poetry. The wind softened, the engines steadied. The road became less a path and more a symbol, a place where the past met the present and forgiveness rode alongside fury. Jack's mind drifted through fragments of his old life, the medals, the letters, the people who had looked away when he fell. He realized something then, something quiet, but true. Dignity doesn't need recognition. It just needs space to exist. He looked over at Cole, the leader who'd shown him that strength can be gentle and justice can be merciful. "Why do you do it?" Jack asked, raising his voice above the wind. "Why help people like me?" Cole's answer came without hesitation. "Because someone once did it for me," he said, "and because if we don't help each other, who will?" The words landed deep, like a lesson carved into bone. That was the hidden code of the iron vows, not loyalty for loyalty's sake, but redemption as a way of life. A decision made daily to fight not with fists or anger but with presence, to show up in a world that keeps telling people like them they don't belong. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the road. The convoy slowed as they reached an overlook that stretched out over miles of open country. They parked their bikes in a line, the engines cutting off one by one until only the wind remained. The quiet that followed was immense, powerful, the kind of quiet that makes you realize you're part of something much bigger than yourself. Jack took off his helmet and inhaled deeply, the scent of gasoline and pine filling his lungs. He turned to Cole. "Feels like I've been gone a long time," he said softly. Cole nodded. "You're back now." Jack looked out at the horizon, the last light slipping away, and for the first time in years he didn't feel small beneath it. He felt grounded, whole. The road ahead was still uncertain, but that didn't scare him anymore, because now he wasn't facing it alone. The others stood quietly, watching the sunset. Some leaned against their bikes, others just stared at the view, lost in their own thoughts. It wasn't celebration, it was communion. A moment shared not in words, but in understanding. Each of them carried ghosts, but out here under the open sky, the weight of those ghosts felt a little lighter. Cole picked up a small stone from the ground and tossed it into the air before catching it again. "You know," he said almost to himself, "people think we ride to escape, but it's not about running away. It's about remembering who we are before the world told us otherwise." Jack smiled faintly. "Guess that's what you mean when you say iron vows, huh?" Cole looked at him, eyes steady. "Exactly. Some promises you don't break. You just keep riding until you make them true." The last bit of sunlight vanished, leaving the world bathed in indigo. The first stars began to appear overhead, faint but constant. The riders mounted their bikes again, headlights cutting through the twilight. Cole revved his engine once, a signal. The others followed, the familiar thunder returning, steady and alive. They rolled back onto the road, their formation perfect, the glow of their lights stretching across the darkness like a living constellation. The world outside their circle was still uncertain, still full of cruelty and chaos, but inside that formation there was order, loyalty, and a sense of purpose that no storm could break. Jack's eyes caught the reflection of his vest in the side mirror, the iron vows patch shining faintly under the beam of a streetlight. He smiled. "Even on the darkest roads," he murmured to himself, "there are still those who fight for the light." And as the convoy disappeared into the night, the sound of their engines rolled across the quiet landscape like a heartbeat that refused to fade, a reminder that mercy can ride just as loud as justice. If this story touched something inside you, if it reminded you that compassion still has a place in this world, write it down below. Just a few words that say, "I'm with you until the end." Because stories like this don't live on views. They live in connection, in the people who carry their message forward. And if you're one of those people, if you believe that light still belongs to those who refuse to give up on humanity, then keep riding with me. There's another story waiting. Right here. Another road to follow, another truth to uncover. Let's keep moving. The night's not over yet. And if you made it all the way here, maybe this story spoke to something inside you too. Maybe it reminded you that strength doesn't always roar, and that sometimes the people who look the toughest are the ones still holding the world together quietly. If it did, let me know in the comments. Just write, "I'm with you until the end." It's a simple way for me to know you were part of this ride, right here until the last turn. And hey, if stories like this move you, if you find a bit of truth or peace in them, subscribe and stay close. This channel was made for people who believe there's still light out there, even when the road gets dark. Your presence here matters more than you think. Before you go, tap the like button. It helps these stories reach more people who might need a reminder that compassion still exists. And if you're still in that reflective mood, there's a video right here that continues this journey. Click it and ride with me a little further. The next story picks up where this one leaves off.